Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and anyone else that is watching or listening to this. My name is Gumshoe, and welcome to the Gumshoe Gamers podcast. Today, we have a special guest who is kind of famous nowadays. Introduce yourself, my good man.
Well, my name is Rhetam. I do challenge runs and challenge type videos of video games on YouTube. I wouldn't really exactly call myself famous, but these past few weeks have been good to me, yes.
Okay. What would you consider would be your proudest achievement?
God, that's a tough question, really. Like, you're really laying the tough questions on me here, are you? Do you mean like YouTube-wise?
That's what I do.
Because like in general, I don't know.
Like in general for like the challenge runs. Like which one was your most proudest? I guess.
Well, Fallout New Vegas was the one that got me the most subscribers by far, but it was, I think, actually the easiest challenge run of them all. The hardest one to do was
and yet PC Gamer called you a madman. So like,
yeah, like the thing was, that's when I started like incorporating permadeath, like to have a bit of extra excitement during the playthrough and everything. But it wasn't necessarily all that difficult. Because Fallout New Vegas and like the armor and the system there, it just makes it all a whole lot easier. For me, the most difficult one was either Fallout 4, No Weapons, No Armor, or Dark Souls 3. Without doubt, Dark Souls 3, No Weapons, No Armor. That was the most difficult one by far.
It wasn't permadeath, so
I know that wasn't permadeath, but now I'm redoing it, and this time it'll be permadeath.
Well, if you did it once, you can do it again.
Well, yes, but doing it without dying.
Yeah, except that now you just can't. Now you just can't die.
Yeah.
So today on the podcast, our main topic is going to be on challenge in video games, how it's done, why people do challenge runs at all, and we're going to look at certain genres of games and how they tend to handle that. But before we get into that, let's get into some of those headlines. So to get the mandatory Sonic reference out of the way, Sonic Mania Plus has finally been released, and it's an amazing DLC. I'm going to keep this really quick because, honestly, I already have talked about this to death so much, but it's really great. It's some of the best DLCs like I've ever seen to be released for any game. For $5, you are getting a lot of content. Not only are you getting 2 new playable characters, you're getting an entire mode that has its own visuals, remixed boss fights, new level transitions for stages that didn't have those in the original game, and it's much more harder too. At least that's what most people seem to be saying. I didn't really find it that harder, but I mean it's definitely not a cakewalk I guess I shouldn't say a cake, like a little cakewalk, but it's definitely more difficult, but I wouldn't say it's like the hardest Sonic game there ever was.
What's like the biggest change from a DLC in the main game?
Oh, the biggest change would have to be just the levels themselves, and the fact that since you now have two new characters with their own unique gimmicks. You have Mighty that can do a ground stomp move basically and go to hidden pathways that way, and you have Ray who can fly or glide, but it's if you know how to use Ray really well, you can just fly through every level. Kind of cheeses the game, but keep in mind that Ray is also one of those characters that's it's really easy to pick up, but kind of hard to master. So I see it more as a reward type of thing, where it's like, well, if you're really good with it, then you're really good with it.
Right. So would you say the DLC characters are more for like people who've already played a lot of the base game? Like they're not like if
I would say the whole like I would say the entire DLC is for that exact reason. If you played a lot of the base game, which people have, then well, here you go. They wanted to make sure that the DLC was worth the $5, and I'd say that it surpassed that. But hey, I appreciate it. So good job on them for releasing some pretty good DLC.
That's good for them. Yeah, I always find it kind of interesting, like DLC-wise, that developers mainly have like 2 ways of doing it. Either it's like, oh, you've beaten the game and you're pretty competent, now let's give it a twist or make it harder and add some end game content. But some DLC also like change the base game in itself. You know what I mean? Like they
Oh
completely
yes.
change, instead of like adding something extra, they just change the base game itself and try to like add onto that.
Yeah, it's kind of like Fallout 4 when it introduced survival, or when it updated survival mode.
Yeah, exactly. Or how in like many strategy games, like for example, Crusader Kings 2, for example, what that does with its DLC is every time you install new DLC, it have like more mechanics and like new things that can happen. But still, it's still like the same game. Pretty
Yeah,
much.
this isn't a simple you just get two characters, which they could have just done. Just been like, oh, now I just get two extra characters. People would people would be like, oh, well, that's it. But at the same time, they would have been fine. But no, this adds an entire new mode, and it is worth it. If you have played Sonic Mania, then well, you probably already have Sonic Mania Plus by this point. So I think that we've been on this topic for long enough. So with that, let's move on to something potentially more negative. Rainbow Six Siege had a update, and we're not talking about the anti-cheat update. We're talking about this new update, which basically allows players to get banned for saying one curse word.
Or I think it's mainly not as much curse words, but more racial slurs, right?
Yeah, it's more racial slurs, but if you say a no word, even if it's a typo, it still counts.
Yeah, like
And this has led to I don't want to say a divide. It's more just like it has led to some pretty interesting strategies of trying to goat people into making themselves banned, or if you're having a bad match, you can just leave the match by doing that.
Kind of
So,
like one example that I found was that when people noticed they had like a Brazilian player, they'd ask him, "Oh, what's black in your language?" And he'd type out negro, because the word for the color black is negro. And of course it sees it as the American English word that's a racial slur, and then the player gets kicked out. Same thing with a player who had the word chink in their username, but like something like regarding armor or whatever. And they were immediately like same thing, like same deal. They were immediately kicked out of the game. I think it's like in theory it's good to hold people accountable. Like if someone's being a toxic asshole and the game developers decide we don't want those types of people playing our games, that's more than fair enough. Like this is not really an issue of free speech or anything. I see some people saying, oh, whatever happened to free speech or whatever. Like you're playing a game. You're playing an online service and the people who create it get to decide what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say.
Yeah, the way that multiplayer works nowadays is that you pay basically permission to use their game, and the company decides what the rules are, and you have to abide by them. They could totally just decide to do this, and they are within their full legal rights, at least over in the U.S. I mean, we could talk about the politics and legal stuff in a different time, but to simplify things, yeah, basically their corporation, they own the game. It's not free speech. Your free speech is not being threatened.
Exactly. Here. See, if you were to type in a racial slur in Rainbow Six and you got kicked, and then the police came at your door to arrest you, then I'd say, all right, no, that's a matter of free speech. But until then,
basically, yeah.
Exactly. No, but I think all these kind of systems are really just a way to hold players accountable for bad behavior, and like the major problem with
which is basically how it worked before we had this current model of matchmaking.
Exactly.
Where everyone had their own servers.
See, yeah, exactly. That's like the point. I think we discussed this before. Like, it was basically about is just simply nowadays, no one's really held accountable for being toxic in games. So, like, you just have matchmaking. You get into a group of 5 with random people you will never meet or never see again against an enemy team that you'll also never meet or never see again unless you add them with a friend's request or whatever. And because of that, some people they don't see any repercussions for being toxic, so they're just being toxic for the sake of it. Like if you'd like to know what a person is like, you have to take away responsibility and see what they'll really do, like when given the freedom. And nowadays, it really doesn't matter anymore because, like I said, there's not really much like there's no consequence to being a toxic asshole to random people online. But before that, like for example, in my teenage years, I used to help run a Gary's Mod server, and those were all like community servers. Like people set it up, and this was like the thing in online games in like the 90s and like the early 2000s for games like that, where pretty much online, people had to set up their own servers. There were admins, there were moderators, there was a server owner, and they had to set up their own rules. And because of that, like if you were being a toxic asshole in a server, the moderators or the players themselves, they could just simply kick you. They could just say like, all right, well, we don't want you here anymore. They could kick you or even worse, ban you. And then you had to find a new, server to play on. And because of that, you had a bit of responsibility. There was an actual consequence to being a toxic asshole. And nowadays you don't really have that anymore because of the way matchmaking works, where you always just, no matter what happens. If I get, for example, if I do something really bad or whatever, and even if I get kicked, because these matchmaking games do have a kick functionality. Doesn't matter, because within 5 minutes I'll be playing a different game with completely different people.
Yeah. Just basically the aspect of responsibility is thrown out of the window, and it enables them to act the way that they do. It's why Xbox Live for a whole when the 360 and that whole generation was known for toxicity, because that's where matchmaking was starting to become super popular, and we started to see more of the negative sides. And this is just a response to that, to try and clean up the mess.
Exactly. And I don't think, it's going to be tough. They tried, and obviously there were some really big major faults in that I'm surprised that I didn't see coming. But at the same time, they do at least try, I guess. And I'm not going to say they should be commended for it, but hey, A for effort and all that. And like I said,
it's a step in the right direction, but I do get the criticism that it's a little too severe. It's just one and then you're instantly banned. There should be lenient. But if they decide to do that, then everyone will just say it once and then that's it. Again, it just enables them. So they were kind of in a lose-lose situation here.
No, exactly. And I think it's just like, the current way online gaming works and online matchmaking works, you're always going to have problems like this. Like back in the days of community servers, sure, you always had responsibility, and there was always this sense of community that you had, because you also always had regulars onto a server, and you yourself became a regular. And then if you were being really toxic, you'd get kicked and banned, and that's fine and everything, that's cool. But what it also meant is that you had to 100% rely on community servers most of the time, instead of official servers.
The company would never ever be like, well, this person's being toxic, so we'll take care of that. They would never do that. They would let the community run itself.
Exactly. And
which some people, I personally would be, I'm more advocating for that. But again, I'm in the mindset where it's like, well, both of these should be able to coexist, and it really depends on the game. I'm actually thinking back on VR chat, if that's still around and people use that, which I think people still use that.
It's around,
that is still that is basically servers that you have to go into, and if you're being a toxic asshole or not really respecting the rules, then yes, you can be banned and kicked from that. So that model is still being used. It's just not being used in AAA multiplayer games, because it's more faster, and it seems to have worked better if they do the matchmaking way.
And nowadays, everyone is super used to the game automatically finding
they're just
super for you.
Yeah, they're just super used to this. This is how multiplayer always works.
Exactly. In some games, if you don't find a match within 3 minutes, all right, we know it. I'll play something else. I guess something's up with the servers or whatever. Actually scrolling through a list, checking which server seems the most fun, which has the most amount of people on, and which has the rules that you like. I don't know. I think that's just too much effort, because we're so used to just being, cared for, and the server being found for us.
As much as we don't like to admit it, we are people that will take something that's more easy and convenient over something that would take longer, even if that longer thing is technically better for us.
Exactly. Convenience trumps, what's it called? What's the word that I'm looking for here?
Conveyance?
You know what? Yes, sure, let's go with that.
Convenience trumps conveyance.
Exactly.
Boom. Hashtag convenience trumps conveyance. We're going to get that trending, please.
I wouldn't be surprised, because, we have so many people.
Oh, yeah. All 3 of them. Nice. All right. Anyway, so that's it for the headlines. Oh well, wait, actually, I just forgot about this, but I might as well address it because it's kind of big. No
Mhm.
Man's Sky got an update, a huge update, an update that basically made it into an entirely different game, and also a much better game. Now, this is something that I may actually discuss on its own podcast. I'm still not deciding if I want to do that, but I wanted to at least address this because I think that it's uh, something that's really cool, and
Um,
it's and while No Man's Sky is what like 2 years, no, like more than 2 years old.
mhm.
The fact that Hello Games were like, well, oh no, wait, whoever the publisher, I forget who was behind the game.
The
Um,
Hello Games. I think it was
oh,
Hello
it was
Games.
Hello Games. Okay, I was like, oh, that doesn't seem right, but that was right. Ooh,
Mhm.
I remembered. But yeah, the fact that they just wanted to make the game that I'm not gonna say they promised, more like they had one guy that just ran his mouth off and didn't know when to shut up. And
Yeah.
now there's like proper online, people can come to your world. There's a third person mode now. There's a lot of things added into it, and yeah, a lot of people seem to be liking the game more, and I say that's all good.
Yeah, like I don't know, like No Man's Sky has always been a bit of a mixed bag for me, especially as these updates came out. Because at one hand, I was like, the fact like it's commendable that even 2 years after the fact, they're still trying to update their game and they have like made significant changes for free and everything. But at the other side, I'm also like, like there were so many things promised by Sean Murray, I believe, before launch, and like literally none of them were true. And some people kind of brush it off as in like, oh, he was just overly excited about his game, or he was just in over his head. But like for example, there was no multiplayer, there was no functional multiplayer in No Man's Sky at launch, and literally every single interview before that, he was like, "Is there a multiplayer? Yes." Yes, like there's a difference between being excited for your game and like straight up
I
lying.
remember. I remember specifically. It was like, it's like, so can you see like other players? It's like, yes, you can, but it'd be very, very rare. It's like you're probably like most people would not see it. I'm like, what? That that's a non-answer. That's like getting our hopes up, but then also saying that, nah, maybe. That's like a maybe. It's like just say that there wasn't. It's just, oh, okay, well, whatever. Anyway, point here is that at least now, for most people, they consider it to be a better game. Um, it's gotten me to think the idea of maybe trying it out. Just because I like space stuff. It's
Hmm.
like it's some of my cool things. I don't know about you, because on your channel you haven't really played a lot of sci-fi stuff, but you like sci-fi?
I do, but like I have literally no experience in like games like that because they're very much just been like an upcoming thing because as computer
But wait a
power and
minute,
processing
wasn't there a
power gets bigger.
sci-fi game that you were really looking forward to for E3 and I think got announced?
No, it wasn't. No, that was more about the fact that Bethesda was going to announce a sci-fi game. They said, and
Ah, okay,
they were
okay.
like, and then I was like, oh yeah, watch this. It's gonna be Starfield. And then a friend of mine was like, didn't believe it, and I was like, just watch. And then like throughout the entire E3
Oh,
thing,
it's Seinfeld, not Starfield.
oh yeah, right. And throughout the entire E3 thing, there was like Fallout and more Skyrim and this and that. We were like, yeah, right, fine. And then suddenly at the very end, it was like Starfield or Seinfeld, if you want to keep it that way. And I was like, see, I told you. But for me, it seems interesting. But the sci-fi genre in like I don't really have much experience with it, mainly because they're very much an upcoming thing. Like Elite Dangerous, Star Citizen, which is probably not going to come out for at least 10 years. No Man's Sky, which is known by some as Elite Dangerous Light, and also Elite Dangerous.
What about the
Uh,
XCOM series? I feel like that.
well, yeah,
I
but
mean,
that's not really. That's more like fighting against aliens in a turn-based system. And I really like
okay.
XCOM, by the way. Like, don't get me wrong. But when I think of like sci-fi games, I think more
You're
of
thinking
as
of the
in
explorative, the
yeah,
massive
I think like you get in
planets.
your spaceship, you fly off into space, and you find a new planet, etc., etc. Like kind of like that. And I think that because of computers keep getting better, we will slowly get more of those types of games, or like incredibly huge and everything. And I do look forward to them, but I literally so far I haven't really delved deep into any of them.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the day where we will actually have that, because that would be really cool. At least I hope so. So anyway, that is it for headlines, and now let's move on to our main topic. So challenge in video games, or really how to program a good challenge, is kind of something that I consider pretty difficult, depending on it depends on the game, like, purely. But uh, for example, you have your games like Dark Souls, or just the whole Souls series, Cuphead, etc., that really relish in giving the player a hard time, but at the end of the day, it still has to feel fair and somewhat balanced and not too cheap. Though Souls definitely have their moments, definitely have their moments.
Right.
But at the same time, though, people enjoy it because they are hard. And I think, to kind of open this up, Rhett, why do you think people like playing hard games? Because, like, I know for us, it's kind of easy. It's kind of easy to look at that. Oh, it's like, it's hard. I like the challenge. But for a lot of people that tend to just see this from outsider perspective, so like, why would you like to play something that's super challenging and difficult?
Well, I think it just kind of goes back to, why do you play video games in the first place? Why do you watch movies in the first place? Why do you read something? Like, why do you read a book in the first place? It's because it's fun, and you simply want to have fun, and people take their fun in different ways. Some want to be completely immersed in a grand adventure in a completely different world, and that's why they play video games. Others, they want to have fun with their friends and do cooperative things, and really want to build up a sense of like teamwork and everything, which I really take joy out of. And others, like me, simply want to have a good challenge that they can overcome and master, and they take their joy out of that. Like, I think it's mainly just about having fun, and like how you do it is kind of dependent on what games you play. And
which is why the concept and not just the concept, but the execution of challenge runs has become something of a bit, I'm not gonna say anomaly, but it has become more commonplace nowadays.
Exactly, because games and the way they handle difficulty is always very different, but some games, they do give you the opportunity to make it even harder for yourself, more so than the developers probably intended. And for me, the joy is in, like, how hard can I make it for myself? And let's, make it as hard as possible, and then see if it is actually possible to beat it. And sure, sometimes I'll just run up into a wall and 100% not be able to move further. And that might be frustrating.
Now
some,
that, I can't move further until something happens. It's kind of the same thing with speedrunning too. I know SGQ happened a while ago, but still, I'll bring this up, that people enjoy trying to beat the game as fast as they can because it's fun to them. And while I totally get, and while I can totally understand that, there's just some games that I'm just like, wait, why would you try and speedrun a Pokemon game? All right, but that's there, and I finally sat down and watched a speedrun of one of those, and I was like, wow, this is actually really amazing. And the fact that a lot of them have to figure out new ways that they can beat the game faster, even if it's just by a second. That's actually really entertaining to watch. And
yeah, I think that kind of goes back to what I said in the beginning about where do people take their joy out of in video games. Like, some take it out to want to be immersed, some take it out of teamwork, some all different types of reasons. And speedrunners, they just want to push the game to their very limit and see how fast they can beat it, and that's for them is fun.
So when you did your Fallout New Vegas run with permadeath and without killing anyone, at least directly, was that you said before that wasn't super difficult, but I assume that required a lot of planning.
It did, and that's mainly because of the game itself. Because, see, Fallout New Vegas is kind of interesting in that there's many different quests hidden in nooks and crannies, and you kind of have to like really know where to go and what to do. And sometimes you can't do a certain quest if a certain faction doesn't like you anymore because you did a different quest in a different order. And some quests like have influence each other and the way they go. And with some quests you can skip. You can pretty much skip entirely if you've already done some other quest. So it does require some kind of planning to know, exactly on what to do and where to go, and you kind of have to like plan that out quite well. But at the same time, like from a pure gameplay perspective, not as in like a planning perspective, but a gameplay perspective, it was much easier than Fallout 4, no weapons, no armor, or anything like that, because the game is much more lenient in letting the player survive, even though the difficulty settings, like difficulty in that game, is done a bit lazy in comparison to Fallout 4 survival mode.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I would have to agree from my time playing with New Vegas. I always just find like, oh well, here's a place I could actually have a quest, and it's also pretty interesting because the way that New Vegas does difficulty, it's kind of interesting. Do you want to talk about that?
I think like not just New Vegas, but it kind of goes into like
Fallout in general, at least 3 and onward.
Well, not even necessarily Fallout actually. I think it's just like a whole concept of difficulty done lazily versus difficulty done well, in my opinion. Because the Elder Scrolls series and the Fallout series and a bunch of other games, sometimes when they do difficulty, they do it kind of in a lazy way. And it can still, lead to a fun challenge run, but it is like, even I have to admit that it's a bit lazy. Like, for example, my current Skyrim run, right? I'm doing Skyrim, no weapons, no armor, permadeath, max difficulty. What does difficulty do in that game? Simple. It literally just makes it so you do, let's say, 5 times less damage, the enemy does 5 times more damage. The developers just kind of like switch over those values a bit. Like, okay, well, the player does less damage now, the higher the difficulty is, the enemy does more damage, the higher the difficulty is, and that's it. For the rest, about the game, nothing changes. And that's a bit of a lazy way to do difficulty, in my opinion, because all it really does is just change the damage values, and it doesn't, make the game more difficult per se. It just kind of makes it more, unfair, because it just kind of makes it so you're no longer on even ground with your enemies. Whereas,
yeah, I think with that, I would have to agree, which is why when Fallout 4, we worked at survival mode, it felt like an actual challenge with different mechanics.
Exactly, and I think that's like the difference between difficulty done well versus difficulty done lazily. Because like I said, if you just change damage values, in my opinion, that's a bit lazy. But then again, when developers do difficulty like that, it is pretty clear that they're not really, that their main focus isn't into making a game more difficult per se. But like difficulty done well, in my experience, is, for example, the Metal Gear Solid series. Because Metal Gear Solid 2, for example, if you put the game on a higher difficulty, sure, you have less health, enemies do more damage, you get spotted, and like stuff like that. But it's also that key items that you need to move on throughout the game are in different, harder to reach places. There are actually like differences in where you have to go, what you have to do, your objective. It all gets a bit more difficult, and I think that's really fun, because in that way you can see that the developers have actually thought about how to make the game more difficult instead of just simply going, well, let's just change these values up a bit and we're done. And I think that's like a good example of difficulty done well, which is the same reason as to why I really liked Fallout 4's survival mode update, because it didn't just change the damage values like it was in the previous Fallout games and the previous Elder Scrolls games. What it actually did is it made it so that you're much more vulnerable, but so are the enemies, because everyone takes more damage. There's this whole new system of diseases. Your carry weight has been reduced. You can't fast travel. You have to eat, drink, and sleep. And like the entire game is like completely changed because of that. And also the fact that, for example, you can only save when you sleep in a bed. So when you find a bed after like a really hard journey and you think, holy crap, I can't die now because I have to restart from like my previous save, which was an hour prior. When you do finally find a bed, you're like, you're celebrating. You're like, holy shit, I actually made it. And you'll never really have that feeling in a normal difficulty playthrough or anything like that. I think that's one of the well, for me, also one of the big reasons as to why I love higher difficulty that much. The feeling of actually making it at the end, like actually like surpassing the challenge and like rising above it, is something
Yeah,
that I really enjoy.
and that's, you know, even going back to like NES days. That's why they are so. That's why at least the good ones, the ones that are more remembered,
Hmm.
even nowadays, they thrive on that. They thrive on giving players a challenge, not just because those games are pretty short and they needed a way to artificially lengthen the time, but also because once you beat the challenge, it's the most rewarding thing ever.
Exactly. And I think, like sometimes people say, like, for example, in Dark Souls, some people, like, it is known for its difficulty, sure, but it also has, like, really great world building and, like, the RPG stats around it are really cool. Like, you can completely change the way you play your character, and every weapon is pretty much viable if you want to make a playthrough out of it and stuff like that. And I think that's really cool. But I think, difficulty is a large part of that game. And I think it's on to the game
And also the way,
developers.
well, and also the way of how it deals with difficulty is, I think, a great model, which is why Souls-like games are super abundant, because it has been it's been very, very, very influential. So for those that don't know, I'll try and sum up the how Souls' difficulty as quick as I can. But the basic gist of it is, the game like the game does not have a difficulty setting. If it did and it had values for everything, it would be broken, even if it artificially made it harder or artificially made it easier because of just values. It would not work. The game, at least from the ones that I play, I haven't really put a lot of time into 2, but I have put time into 1 and 3. And what I can tell is that most of the game is you just kind of saying, well, I'm going to start out with this type of build and this type of class, and then the difficulty lies in which encounters you will have, and of course, you getting used to how the game functions and learn. And there's lots of learning curves, and but the best thing about Souls-like games, at least the good, or at least the good ones, is that no matter what you do, there is always a viable strategy for it. If you're a tank and you can get a lot of hits, well that's great. If you are more of a magic, well then there's usually a strategy for that. I know the Quelaag boss in Dark Souls 1, I think there's like a strategy for almost every single build.
I think so, yes. And I think, like going back onto like why that game is so hard, it's very much a developer's choice, which is
Oh
something that
yes.
I think that every developer should make their own choice in and shouldn't feel like they have to. Because if you look at, for example, going back to RPGs like, let's say Skyrim, right? Like, why do people play Skyrim? Lots of different reasons. Difficulty is probably one of the smaller ones. No one goes into an RPG like Skyrim and thinks, "Ooh, I want to have a really difficult time. Like, I want to, really have a
No,
challenge."
you go for Cuphead for you go to Cuphead for that.
Yeah, like exactly. Like you go into a different game for that, and the reason you're going to Skyrim is because you want to build a character. You want to be cool. You want to do all these. You want to explore this really cool fantasy world and do many different quests and level up and get all these cool powers, etc., etc., etc. But like challenge isn't really one of the bigger ones, and that's why I think in those games it's very obvious why the developer put in so many different types of difficulty settings, because some people aren't into it for the difficulty itself, and some are. And if you're in it for a difficulty, fine, crank it up. If you're not, that's completely cool too. And I think in like the whole thing about Dark Souls is you're undead who've like in a cursed world and everything is screwed, and things are going really badly and everyone's struggling and suffering, and they also want to invoke that challenge. Like when you do beat the boss, they want you to really feel proud about it and everything. And that's why I think the difficulty in that game is very natural. Like it suits the environment, it suits the setting. And I think the developers, kind of went for that. And
Yeah,
like,
like you can tell that everything, at least the more the better parts that people remember are probably the parts that the team put a lot of effort into, and you can tell especially that a lot of care and effort went into each of the Souls games, even two, which people love or hate. There is effort in there to make sure that the game is at least balanced.
exactly. And like I think like that's for them it's a very natural reason as to why there isn't a difficulty setting. And for me, it feels kind of hollow to have like an easier difficulty for Dark Souls. But then again, it's all about the developers. If they come and make a new Dark Souls tomorrow and they say I want an easier difficult, like they put in like easier difficulty settings, I'd be cool with that. I don't really care all that much. Sure, it's fun for bragging rights.
People, see, and this also kind of goes into one of the other topics too. Is like, is that people tend to get very, very, very defensive about a game adding in an easy option or a narrative setting that's just so you can experience the story, because apparently that makes the game worse, even though you literally could just play your preferred mode.
Yeah, like when you say people, you pretty much just mean like sweaty nerds.
Exactly.
Like who really cares, honestly?
Well, I mean, I'm in this, a pretty hot area right now, so I'm kind of a sweaty nerd, but
yeah, I know, but like
but the actual ones that are always sweaty, even in winter.
Like, exactly. Like, who honestly cares if someone... Like, I play Skyrim on legendary difficulty right now with all these different caveats. I'm making it myself hard. Like, why do I care if someone wants to play it on very easy difficulty and just simply want to enjoy the game? Hey, if they enjoy it more that way, more power to them. Like, why would I care? I never really got that. Like, I never got why people... Like, even I, like... Not gonna lie, a part of why I do these challenge runs too is 100% for bragging rights, because it's kind of cool to say, I beat Dark Souls 3 with no weapons and no armor, like, and no one else did. Boom. Like, like it feels cool to say, sure. But at the same time, I don't care if someone plays it on like the easiest build you can get in that game, and I wouldn't feel like better than them or anything. It's simply a way of like how you enjoy the game more, and like bragging rights is fun and all. And I think like the reason why those sweaty nerds get so sweaty and like mad about that is because they feel like their own accomplishments in the game are diminished if someone else can do the same thing but have an easier time doing it.
Yeah. So I just 100% agree with that. And yeah, there is a lot of people that also on the other side say, well, you're just playing the harder mode just for bragging rights. And yes, exactly, that is there, but it's also because you enjoy that.
Exactly. Like,
so yeah,
it's all a mix. Like, it's not 100% I want to challenge myself. It's also a bit of, oh cool, bragging rights. I enjoy that. Sure. If I can, like, I'm not gonna like openly brag about it because I like to stay humble. Oh, I like to think I'm humble at least, but I'm not. But
at least more humble than most people. All right.
Well, I mean, like, don't ask my friends, so they'll probably say I'm not humble at all.
Don't at you. We got it. We got it. You heard it here. You heard it here first, folks.
Who even am I? None of you know who I am. It's all good.
Well, you introduced yourself at the beginning, so I'm pretty sure they now know who you are. So you can't do that excuse. It doesn't work. Oh well. Anyway, another thing that I kind of want to talk about is especially if going back to the RPGs and how they would do difficulty. I actually think back to like the Witcher series and how I think that has a good array of how difficulty is, especially in 3, where the easier modes, and like normal and like easy mode, tend to be very much for like your basic 3 modes, easy, normal, whatever the hardest one was called, tend to be more of like the easy is more for narrative, and then you got normal, which is more of a medium. But if you go for the hard mode, then they really want you to use a lot of the extra oils and really know, like, whenever you're gonna fight a new monster, you need to research it and know like what's its weakness, because if you don't know what its weakness is, then you're gonna have a really hard time. It's almost gonna be impossible. When you're doing it on normal or easy mode, you never really feel like you have to do that, but it's just an extra edge, but you can totally just beat it normally and it's fine.
I think that kind of goes back into like good difficulty as well, like how you do difficulty well, in that if you want to play at a higher difficulty and succeed, you do need to have a better understanding and a better mastery of the game mechanics than you would on lower difficulty settings. Like, Same thing with Dark Souls 3, for example. If I want to be able to beat that game without weapons, without armor, I need to be able to roll very effectively and, like,
No
make
fat. No,
sure.
your fat roll for days.
Exactly. Like, and make sure I know how to dodge, and make sure I know how to do backstabs for maximum damage and everything. Whereas if you were to use a more traditional weapon and also like a shield, for example, you don't really need to dodge in most occasions. You can simply block, and it's an easier alternative, and that's completely fine too. But, like, if you want to make it more more difficult for yourself, you just kind of need a better understanding of the game mechanics.
Yeah, and even going back to the whole sweaty nerds complaining about things they don't really need to complain about. That's a way of a lot of people just like, oh, you use a shield in Dark Souls, well then this is not a real playthrough. Which I'm like, what is going on? Like people can prefer that, and I actually think that's a more natural way of doing difficulty. Like we were saying, the Soul series it's like seriously, the whole Soul series is just a great example of how to do difficulty without a difficulty setting.
Right.
And I just think that that's one of the most interesting things about it. But anyway, let's move off from single player games, because there's another aspect of challenge, and that comes in the form of multiplayer, which which I would consider is so hard to program for a challenge, because how do you decide to balance things? I mean, like we'll probably just talk about your standard, just to kind of simplify things. We'll talk about your standard type of FPS sort of games, and fighting games too, and maybe a bit of like MOBAs. So let's start off with FPSs.
I think a thing about difficulty in multiplayer, it's extremely difficult to do because you have players on both sides of the equation. Like, if I do a cheap tactic in Dark Souls, for example, to beat a boss, that boss isn't gonna go complain on the official forums about it that I'm being unfair, like a player would. Like, and I think that's a very hard thing. You want it to be fun for both sides. You want it to be balanced, and I think having balance and at the same time being a challenge that's not unfair is really tricky to do, especially in both fighting games as well as FPSs, and even in not PvP games.
Even in the Soul series, they have a PvP mode which can sometimes be very one-sided.
Exactly, because the game isn't really made for that. It's just kind of like a fun extra.
Yeah.
It's like, but even in like games that are not player versus player, but player versus environment, like for example, Payday 2. I don't know if you've ever played it, but it's basically a game.
Have.
Yeah, it's a fun game.
I
Like,
love it.
It's a game with like 4 people where you rob banks, museums, etc., etc. You just do all these heists, and
yeah, and the difficulty just depends on the challenge of and how well you have to cooperate with other players. Now that I think is actually really, really great for cooperative play. I feel like that wouldn't be too. I mean, it'd still be harder to program in the challenge depending on the game, of course. But the fact that now you have to know that all the online players and all the online components are going to be cooperative, you can design difficulty around of, okay, how cooperative do they need to be? How planned out do they have to be for this sort of mission? Like for an easy mission, you could have one guy that's like super reckless and you could still be fine. But maybe for a harder mission, you would have to not have any wild cards in your team of 4 because you would just instantly fail.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, going back on like the whole PvE thing, even in PvE games, if players notice, for example, that they're less effective with their current build because you have like different types of skill sets and everything in that game, and if players notice with their weapons are not as strong as other players, or with their skill sets are not as good as other players, they will complain on official forums about it. So even balance in games where you go against AI is very important and hard to balance because there's always other players involved, which brings a whole new thing of difficulty.
Exactly. And when you though at the same time, it's just kind of one of those unavoidable things. Like again, we were talking when we were addressing Rainbow Six Siege. There's a lot of just lose scenarios. It's like this just kind of comes with the territory of doing, like, if you do an FPS multiplayer game, no matter what you do, people will complain. It's it's impossible. There's no way that you could have a whole community of people that play a certain multiplayer game and all of them will be like, yeah, this is pretty good. This is pretty balanced. Someone will find something to complain about.
Yeah, exactly. Like people always complain, and I think difficult like multiplayer games are one of the hardest things to do properly, difficulty wise, as well as many different factors, because there's always that human unpredictability that people have to account for.
And at the same time, though, that can be the draw of the challenge, is trying to outsmart others. I think that's why I always wanted to give For Honor a try, because I thought that trying to learn how to outsmart your opponent in these battles seems really fun.
Definitely.
And I mean that's also like why I play fighting games too, because it's trying to outsmart your opponent unless they get you into a combo that you literally can't block off from, and then you're just like helpless.
Yeah, definitely. Like even in, for example, For Honor, which I play a lot with friends and everything, it's really fun to just simply play that game, and like you have to kind of go with mind games, which is what you think these guys, like your opponent, probably won't see coming or can't respond to properly. But even in that game, like some heroes are better than others, or some people feel that way at least, and then they complain in the official forums, and you still have like a balancing issue, and balancing is like the hardest thing about doing difficulty well in multiplayer games.
Yeah, because what would constitute as a balanced game for one person is a unbalanced game for another person. I actually think that Overwatch, despite all the people that claim, oh, this needs a buff, this needs a nerf, this needs a buff, and like they're constantly doing that, I feel like because that they like constantly change, or not really change, but they update a lot. It more feels like, okay, so now we're gonna change how everything works, and players now have to realize, okay, what's been changed, and have to work and adapt through that, which I think retroactively kind of makes the game balanced in a way.
Yeah, like I think they'll never, like, there will be no game that's ever going to be 100% balanced. Like, not even chess, for example, because white starts off, so white has an inherent
yeah, well, you see, white has white power, and well, whoops. And that's why Connect 4 is black and red, not black and white.
No, but even in games like chess, like I said, you have like equal pieces and everything. But one player starts before the other, and therefore has an inherent advantage.
Yeah, it has an inherent. That's exactly how it is. There's always. I think the thing is that there's always a level of unfairness. It's just whether or not you can count that as an unfair for you. Like for chess, yeah, someone would totally say, well, you get to go first, and that's not fair, but that's how the game is played. And yet, that doesn't mean that the person that goes first will always win, because it's not that huge of an advantage. It's just a slight advantage.
Exactly. And, that's why in chess tournaments, for example, they do multiple games where one player starts off as white, and then the next round he starts off as black, etc. Just to kind of offset the advantage.
So yeah, and just you're just going. The realm of games also impacts the realm of video games, and maybe vice versa. I'm not 100% sure, but fighting games I also feel like have a pretty hard time with this too, because like some of my favorite fighters have terribly unbalanced rosters. Like there are clearly ones that are just so much better. And that's the reason ban lists were made. So if you ever do an official tournament, you can't use a certain character over something else.
Right. And yeah, exactly. Like that's why in some games, like they flat out ban characters or ban items or ban like some things because it's just simply not. I think that kind of becomes really annoying. Well, not annoying, but it just kind of takes away from the game. Like for example, Left 4 Dead, right? It had like all these different types of items and weapons and all that. And it was actually really fun to play. But then in official tournaments, they take away like so many different items that you can use and so many different game mechanics and everything because it's simply imbalanced. And then for the sake of balance, they take out major chunks of the game, which I'm kind of like,
Oh, well, then, yeah, whoops, this doesn't seem right. Oh, well, I think one last game we want to talk about before we we end this off is the battle royale scene, and how it does its difficulty, because that's also pretty. I'm not gonna say it's 100% unique, but um, let's just say the way that Fortnite deals with difficulty is actually very different than the way that PUBG is difficult.
I have very little experience in battle royale, so
Okay, well then
go ahead, my friend.
I'll try to explain my best, because I have I have very little experience with both, but I have played both for at least like, I want to say like at least, I don't know, 5+ hours each. So I know some things, but from my observation and from what I've gathered around, Fortnite is a lot more faster paced. It's a lot, you have to really get to know about the building mechanics. You got to know where you have to kind of anticipate what your opponent will do. It also has a lot more extra modes, and each mode that you tend to do will have its own set of challenges. Where and it's more like, and it's more faster paced, I guess is what I was trying to say. But PUBG is more deliberate. It's kind of like a Souls game in that way, where if you decide to go to this house, like, well, that's just your commitment. You can't take that path. It's gonna take you a while just to get there, and you gotta hope that there's actually good things there. And if there isn't, then, well, whoops. I guess you kind of just ruin time, and that's why every single match feels a lot different, because there's a level of RNG, which does make the game, I feel, more challenging than Fortnite, but ultimately it kind of works in its favor. Also the way that guns are done, also the way that guns are shown to be more realistic and actually have like bullet drops instead of Fortnite, where it's literally just a straight line, and you also have like these shields and weird things and just very video gamey stuff. They're two separate things, and how they deal with difficulty is pretty pretty different. But the one constant thing, this is what I really wanted to kind of segue in, is that they both have a level of RNG. And kind of going back to what we were talking about with multiplayer, one of the other things I feel like is super hard to do for it, whatever you want to do, is RNG. How do you make RNG fair?
I think the RNG, like when you have the worst, luck during a run of a game, it should still be possible. Like, it shouldn't be impossible. It should be a challenge, because we just have bad luck. It should be a bigger challenge, sure, but not impossible. And with good RNG, it should make it a lot easier, but also still, but also not. What should I say? Like, it's difficult, because like with good RNG, you want the game to still be fun, but not a complete cakewalk, I guess. And
kind of like, I guess we'll do an analogy like poker, I guess, is a good analogy.
Yeah, like you said, like with poker, for example, even with the worst hand in the world, you can still win if you play it right. And I think RNG should be kind of like that, where like even if you have the worst RNG in the world, it shouldn't be impossible to still win the game.
Which then also throws the question of, well, what about roguelikes? And I think that for what I think for roguelikes, again, it kind of depends on a game by game basis. One game I think that does it pretty great is Enter the Gungeon. That is a ridiculously hard game, but it's so much fun, and I feel like no matter what I do, every time I've died it's my own fault, because I didn't realize that I could have easily, that like every single time that you get into a new room or something, there's always there's always like maybe some cover that you can do, and your base weapon that you have is not terrible. Sure, it may not be as good as other guns you may or may not get depending on RNG, but I never feel like it's impossible to beat. It's just hard. And next time I ever encounter maybe an enemy that gave me real trouble, I'll know properly how to dodge it. Compare that to something like Binding of Isaac, where I feel like that is 100% RNG. Whether or not you're going to get a good run or not is completely RNG. And I feel like for a lot of bosses and such, you need to have good items, because if you don't have good items, then it just becomes so much harder. And especially because that game also has like other characters, and they have their own special abilities, and it just certain characters are just much better than others. Enter the Gungeon also had multiple characters too, but every single one of them didn't really feel like it was too much of a that they were like retroactively better than the other.
Right. So I think that just kind of goes back to balance and the fact that what we said with it kind of has to be like poker, where even with even with the worst hand, you should still be able to win.
Yep. That's basically where I stand on that. So make sure that if you decide to program in RNG to try and at least make it to where if a player has a really, really bad string of luck, then they're not. It doesn't deter them from playing more of your game.
Right. Exactly.
And I think with that is where we are going to end the podcast. So I want to thank everyone for watching, for listening, rather, and I want to thank my special guest Rhetam for his insightful commentary. Where can they find you?
On my YouTube channel, pretty much. If you type in Rhetam, you should find me. Also on Twitter, Rhetam with an extra M because Rhetam
Someone
was already taken.
Someone took Rhetam. Oh,
yeah.
Rip.
So you know, you
will also find those links in the description if you're watching us on YouTube, and the description and the website if you're listening to it over there. I guess. Shame that Apple Podcast doesn't allow me to put in links there, but I'll try my hardest. With that, I also want to give a big shout out to my Patreon supporters for basically making it so I can get a better computer and better equipment. I am actually recording. I think this is. I don't know if this is the first podcast, but I believe it is, where I'm actually recording this off of a XLR microphone that I have. So it's great. Thank you all for doing that and being just generally awesome. I guess this is also the time where I should address that. I'm kind of sorry that this podcast was out a bit later than usual. We had some technical difficulties on our side, but at least I still will get one out. So hey, there's that. In any case, folks, I just want to say, hope you have a good day, night, evening, whatever time it is right now, and I will see you. Well, I won't see you, but I'll hear you. I don't know. This outro is really weird. I had something planned and I was like, no, wait, that's not funny. Whoops. Oh well, whatever. Catch you in the next one, I guess. Bye.
Bye.